Okay, so the last video in this series on this area of a triangle program is to have a look at the JavaScript. So remember when we did the HTML, the key link to the JavaScript, well, there were two, so we need to make sure that up in our script tag, up in the header section, our triangle.js file is linked to correctly, so that's been spelt correctly, and we're linked to the right file. And the other thing to make sure is that, and the link, the user action that triggers the JavaScript to run in this case is when they click on that button. So in our HTML we've got that input button down in the bottom there of our table, and the onClick event is the key thing, and the onClick event triggers this JavaScript function called calculate, which we haven't created yet. We're about to create that right now to run. So when they click that, it's going to go looking into our JavaScript file, which we've linked to up in the header section, and it's going to find that in there we've created a function called calculate, funnily enough. So it's using exactly the same name, calculate with a capital C. Functions typically get capital letters. So we've talked about standard variables typically having a lowercase letter to begin with. That's because functions typically get capital letters. It's just a bit of a JavaScript standard. Just like a CSS rule, a JavaScript function is enclosed with these curly brackets, and then here is all of the code that makes up that function. So whenever that function gets called by the user clicking the button in this case, this is all of the stuff that happens. So there's some comments here. You'll see we've got we're setting a variable called height, and we're making that variable equal to document.getElementById, where the ID value we're having it check for is called txt height. This text box here is the item with the ID value txt height. You can go back to your HTML and you can see that that's the value with our text box called txt height right here. So you can see how that's got an ID value of txt height right there. So whatever the user enters, it's collecting that. The JavaScript is collecting that value, and it's applying an eval function across it. So that's making sure it's evaluating that as a number, rather than so that the user enters text. It's just going to it's not going to affect our program. Ideally, I'd have an error trap in there, but we'll get to that when we start looking at branching, because that uses a selection type of block, which we'll talk about in a couple of projects' time. I'm then setting a variable called base, which is essentially doing exactly the same thing. Document.getElementById txt base, which is saying .value, which is saying give me the value from that the user has entered into the text box with the ID txt base, and load that into my variable called base. And then I'm applying the eval function to the base variable to do the same thing to make sure that what's been entered into my variable is being treated as a number. And then I've got my variable area, so declaring a variable called area and performing a calculation, so saying that that's equal to my height times base divided by 2. So that's obviously the formula for calculating the area of a triangle. Then what I need to do is take my answer, my result, my area variable, and output it back to my HTML so it loads into this pink cell here. And to do that, to send my variable back to HTML, we've seen this as well. Document.getElementById. I want to go and get the ID, the element with the ID result, which is this cell down here that I've given it, and I want to say inner.inner.html. So in other words, write into the HTML of that cell the value of my area variable. So it's going to be whatever the result is here, having calculated that based on what the user entered for the base and the height values. And that's my JavaScript. So if I just quickly test that, if I enter a value of 45 will do for height, and say 6 for base, and I click calculate, I get a value of 135. So that's my program working.